The Atlantic Ocean in late 1942 appeared calm on many days, but its quiet surface often concealed events that left no witnesses. Far from the sight of land, long shipping lanes stretched between continents. Cargo vessels crossed these routes steadily, carrying supplies that moved the machinery of a global war. In that vast distance, individual ships could disappear without warning. The central Atlantic is defined by scale. Water extends in every direction beyond the horizon. The nearest coastline may be thousands of kilometers away. During the Second World War, merchant ships traveled these waters under constant risk. German submarines moved beneath the surface, hunting vessels that carried fuel, food, and equipment across the ocean. Despite the danger, merchant traffic did not stop. Ships sailed quietly through open water, often alone. One of those vessels was the British merchant cargo ship SS Benlament. In November 1942, it was crossing the Atlantic as part of the wartime merchant fleet. The ship carried cargo and a multinational crew drawn from several parts of the world. Like many merchant vessels during the war, it traveled without escort. The Atlantic around it was wide and empty. Days passed with little change in the horizon. Waves moved steadily under the hull, and the ship continued its long route across open water. For the men aboard, the voyage was another routine crossing in a dangerous ocean. But somewhere below the surface, unseen and silent, another vessel was already moving into position. The man who would eventually face the open Atlantic alone was Poon Lim, a young Chinese seaman working in the British merchant fleet during the Second World War. He was born in 1918 on Hainan Island, a tropical island off the southern coast of China. At the time, the island was largely rural. Fishing villages and small communities lined its shores. For many families, the sea was not simply part of the landscape. It was a source of work and movement beyond the island. Lim grew up in a large family. Opportunities on Hainan were limited, and like many young men of the region during the early 20th century, he eventually looked toward maritime work. Merchant shipping offered wages and the possibility of travel far beyond the island where he had been born. By the late 1930s, the world was moving toward conflict. China was already deeply involved in war with Japan. Merchant shipping became one of the few stable paths for employment abroad. Lim left home and joined the merchant marine, eventually working with ships connected to the British fleet. The merchant navy during the war was not a formal military branch, but its role was essential. Civilian ships carried fuel, machinery, food, and raw materials between continents. These voyages kept supply lines functioning across thousands of miles of ocean. For the crews who served aboard them, the work was demanding and often dangerous. Chinese sailors formed a significant portion of the labor force on many British merchant vessels during this period. They were experienced seamen and often worked in engine rooms, kitchens, and other operational roles on cargo ships. Conditions were not always equal to those of British crews, but their presence was critical to keeping ships operational. By 1942, Lim was serving aboard the British cargo vessel SS Benlament. His role on the ship was that of a steward. In practical terms, this meant he worked in the ship's service areas, helping manage food preparation and general duties that supported the crew during long voyages. Life aboard a merchant ship followed a structured rhythm. The vessel moved steadily across open ocean routes. Crews worked shifts. Meals were prepared in small galley kitchens. Equipment was maintained. The ship's officers monitored navigation and weather patterns. Outside the ship, the Atlantic remained immense and largely empty. But by 1942, the ocean had become one of the most contested spaces in the war. German submarines operated across large sections of the Atlantic, targeting merchant shipping in an effort to disrupt Allied supply routes. These submarines, known as U-boats, traveled submerged for long distances and surfaced only when necessary. Their attacks were often sudden. Many merchant ships had little warning before a torpedo struck. Convoys with naval escorts had begun to reduce the losses in some regions, but not every vessel traveled in protected groups. Some ships crossed the ocean alone, depending on speed, route changes, or timing to avoid detection. The SS Benlament was one of those ships moving independently across the Atlantic. In November 1942, it was traveling westward through open water. The journey had already covered thousands of miles, and the crew continued their routine work as the ship pushed steadily through long Atlantic swells. For the men on board, the voyage was simply another assignment in a long chain of crossings. For Poon Lim, it was another stretch of time at sea, far from the island where he had grown up. What none of the crew could see was the silent movement of a submarine somewhere beneath the surface of the same ocean. On the evening of the 23rd of November, 1942, the British cargo vessel SS Benlamond was moving through the central Atlantic. Night had settled over the ocean. In wartime conditions, ships often traveled with limited lighting to reduce the chance of being seen from a distance. The sea around the vessel was dark and wide, broken only by the movement of waves along the hull. Below the surface, a submarine had already located the ship. The vessel was German submarine U-172, part of the German Navy's Atlantic campaign against Allied merchant shipping. U-boats were designed to operate silently across long distances, waiting for opportunities to strike vessels traveling without escort. At some point during that night, the submarine fired a torpedo. The impact was immediate. The torpedo struck the SS Benlamond, sending a powerful shock through the structure of the ship. Explosions and flooding followed quickly. Merchant cargo vessels were not designed to withstand direct submarine attacks, and when a torpedo reached its target, the damage was often catastrophic. Within moments, the situation on board changed completely. Crew members rushed from their stations as the ship began taking on water. Equipment shifted. Compartments flooded. The stability of the vessel began to fail. In darkness and confusion, the men on board attempted to escape the sinking ship. Some tried to reach lifeboats. Others jumped directly into the ocean. The speed of the attack left little time for organized evacuation. Among those forced into the water was Poon Lim. Like many of the crew, he had little more than a life jacket and whatever he could reach in the chaos of the moment. The SS Benlamond did not remain afloat for long. Within minutes, the vessel slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic. The ocean closed over the wreckage, leaving scattered debris and survivors struggling in the dark water. Lim found himself alone in the open sea. Waves moved steadily through the wreckage field. The night remained quiet except for the movement of water and fragments of the destroyed ship drifting in the swell. Somewhere nearby, a small object floated among the debris. It was a Carly life raft, a circular wooden flotation platform designed for emergency use. These rafts were built to remain afloat even when ships sank quickly. Lim managed to reach it. He pulled himself onto the raft and looked out across the dark ocean. The SS Benlamond was gone. The crew had vanished into the night, scattered across the Atlantic. By the time the waters settled again, the ocean around him was empty, and the raft was now his only ground in the middle of the sea. The object that kept Poon Lim above the water was a standard naval Carly life raft. Carly rafts were simple structures designed for emergencies at sea. A circular frame made of metal tubing formed the outer ring. Around it was cork or kapok packing, sealed inside canvas, providing flotation even if parts of the raft were damaged. A wooden slatted floor crossed the center, just large enough for a few survivors to sit above the water. The raft Lim reached had drifted free from the sinking of the SS Benlamond. When he pulled himself onto it, he was alone. In the darkness, it was difficult to see what remained from the wreck of the ship. The Atlantic moved steadily beneath the raft, lifting it and lowering it with each passing swell. Lim stayed on the small platform through the night, surrounded by open water. At first light, he was able to examine the raft more carefully. Emergency rafts sometimes carried small supplies, and this one had not drifted completely empty. Inside a secured container were several items intended to support survivors in the first days after a shipwreck. There were tins of ship's biscuits. There were a few cans of water, a small quantity of chocolate, some flares for signaling, a flashlight, and a length of rope. The supplies were limited, but they represented the only resources available. The ocean around him stretched in every direction without interruption. There was no land in sight, and there were no ships visible on the horizon. Lim began to ration the food immediately. The biscuits were dry, and designed to last long periods without spoiling. He broke them into small portions and ate sparingly. The water was more important. Each tin had to last as long as possible. The raft itself provided only minimal shelter. During the day, the sun reflected strongly from the surface of the water. At night, the air cooled quickly. The platform had no sides high enough to block wind or spray. Waves occasionally washed across the wooden slats, soaking everything on the raft. Lim remained seated or crouched for most of the time. Standing was difficult due to the raft's small size and constant movement. Within the first days, the routine of survival began to take shape. He checked the supplies. He watched the horizon. He waited for rain. Fresh water would become the most critical factor in long-term survival at sea. Rainstorms could provide temporary relief if the water could be collected and stored. Lim began experimenting with ways to use parts of the raft to gather rainwater when clouds formed overhead. Pieces of canvas and the structure of the raft itself could be used to guide water into containers. The ocean environment also offered another possibility. Fish moved beneath the raft constantly. Small marine life often gathered around floating objects in the open sea. At first, Lim had no equipment to catch them, but the idea remained present as he examined the rope and metal fragments available on the raft. The first days passed slowly. The initial supplies were still present, and his physical strength remained relatively stable. But the Atlantic offered no sign of land or passing ships. Time began to lose its clear structure. Morning arrived, the sun rose, the raft drifted, evening returned, night covered the ocean again, and in every direction, the water remained the same. The raft moved quietly across the Atlantic, carrying a single survivor from a ship that had already vanished beneath the surface. As the days continued, Poon Lim began adjusting his behavior to the realities of long-term survival at sea. The emergency supplies aboard the raft were never intended to support a person for extended periods. The biscuits and water were designed to last days, not weeks. From the beginning, Lim understood that the food on the raft would eventually disappear. The Atlantic itself would have to provide the rest. Fish gathered beneath the raft almost constantly. Floating structures in open ocean often attract marine life, creating small ecosystems in otherwise empty water. Lim began experimenting with ways to catch them. The raft carried a flashlight. Inside it was a small metal spring. Lim removed the spring and carefully bent the metal into the shape of a hook. It was not designed for fishing, but it could hold a line. Using rope fibers from the raft, he fashioned a crude fishing line. At first, catching fish was uncertain. The hook had no proper bait. Lim used small fragments of biscuit or scraps from earlier catches once fish began appearing near the raft. Gradually, he began to succeed. When fish were caught, they provided both food and additional resources. Some were eaten raw. Others were dried in the sun on the wooden slats of the raft. Fish bones could be shaped into additional hooks, improving his ability to catch more food. Over time, fishing became part of a daily routine. Birds also played a role in his survival. Seabirds occasionally landed on the raft, attracted by the fish or by the floating structure itself. Lim learned to remain still when birds approached. At times, he was able to catch them by hand. The birds provided fresh meat and additional bait for fishing. Their blood also served as a limited source of hydration when fresh water supplies were low. Water remained the most difficult problem. Rainstorms passed across the Atlantic at irregular intervals. When rain fell, Lim used pieces of canvas and the structure of the raft to guide water into the containers that once held the emergency rations. Each storm became an opportunity to refill the limited supply. Between storms, the sun remained intense. The raft offered almost no shade, and constant exposure to sunlight caused severe strain on the body. Lim worked to create some protection using the materials available. Pieces of fabric and canvas from the raft were arranged into a simple shelter. It was not large, but it provided partial shade during the hottest hours of the day. The ocean environment also brought constant hazards. Sharks frequently circled the raft. In the open Atlantic, predators often investigate floating objects where fish gather. Lim could see their fins cutting through the surface of the water as they moved around the platform. At times, they struck the fish he was trying to catch. Once, after catching a larger fish, a shark lunged close enough to the raft that Lim struck it with a wooden plank to drive it away. The raft itself remained his only protection from the water below. Despite these dangers, routine became a form of control. Each day followed a pattern. Morning brought fishing. The cooler hours made it easier to work with the lines and hooks. During midday heat, Lim stayed under the small shelter he had created. In the late afternoon, he returned to fishing or prepared fish to dry in the sun. Night brought another kind of quiet. The ocean darkened completely once the sun disappeared. Stars appeared above the raft in large numbers, unobstructed by land or buildings. The raft drifted slowly with ocean currents that Lim could not see or measure. Days passed, then weeks. Lim had no accurate way to count the time, but he began marking small lines on the wood of the raft to track the passing of days as best he could. Ships occasionally crossed the Atlantic shipping lanes, but they were difficult to see from the level of the water. The raft was small and easily lost in the movement of waves. More than once, distant vessels passed without noticing the solitary figure drifting far below their decks. The ocean continued moving beneath the raft, and each day required the same quiet effort to remain alive. Weeks passed on the open Atlantic, and the raft carrying Poon Lim continued drifting across the ocean. By this stage, survival had become a system. Fishing lines were repaired regularly. Hooks made from bone or bent metal were stored carefully, so they would not be lost to the water. Pieces of fish were dried whenever the sun allowed it, creating small reserves that could be eaten later when fishing was less successful. Rainstorms determined the rhythm of fresh water. When clouds gathered on the horizon, Lim prepared the containers he had saved from the original emergency supplies. Canvas pieces were positioned so that falling rain would collect and run toward the openings of the tins. Some storms lasted only minutes. Others continued for hours. Each one extended his ability to survive. The Atlantic environment, however, remained unpredictable. Some days brought calm water that barely disturbed the raft. On other days, the ocean rose in long rolling swells that lifted the raft high and dropped it again into the trough between waves. Storms occasionally passed directly over the drifting platform. During heavy weather, Lim secured himself to the raft, using rope so he would not be thrown into the water. The raft itself was built to remain afloat even when waves washed across it, but the conditions could be violent. Wind drove spray across the surface, soaking everything that remained on the platform. When the storm passed, the ocean slowly settled again. Sharks remained a constant presence. Fish gathering beneath the raft attracted predators, and the dark shapes often circled just below the surface. Lim learned to recognize their movements and avoid reaching too far into the water when retrieving fishing lines. At one point during the drift, a shark came close enough that Lim attempted something unusual. According to later accounts, he managed to capture a small shark that became entangled near the raft. Using available tools and force, he killed it and pulled it onto the platform. The meat provided food for several days, and the liver was consumed for its nutritional value. Events like this were rare, but they demonstrated how his survival strategies continued to evolve. Time itself became difficult to measure. Without a watch or calendar, Lim relied on marks carved into the wood of the raft to track passing days. Even this system became uncertain when storms erased the marks or when exhaustion caused him to lose count. The sky and ocean became the only consistent reference points. Sunrise and sunset provided structure. At night, the stars shifted gradually across the sky as the raft drifted through different parts of the Atlantic. Occasionally, distant ships appeared on the horizon. From the low height of the raft, these vessels were small silhouettes against the water. Lim used the signaling flares that had been stored on the raft when he believed a ship might see them, but distance and weather often worked against him. On at least one occasion, a passing ship came close enough that he believed rescue was possible. Yet the vessel continued on its course, never turning toward the raft. From the deck of a cargo ship, a single person on a small life raft could easily disappear between the crests of waves. As the weeks continued, Lim's body changed under the constant exposure to sun, salt, and wind. His skin darkened and hardened. Weight was lost gradually, despite the fish he managed to catch. Salt sores and dehydration remained constant risks, but the routines he had established continued. Fishing, repairing lines, collecting rainwater, marking days. The raft drifted with ocean currents that slowly carried it westward across the Atlantic. Lim had no way to know where those currents were leading. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the coastline of South America. But from the surface of the raft, the ocean still appeared endless. By the time several months had passed, the long drift across the Atlantic had begun to take a visible toll on Poon Lim. The routines that had sustained him remained in place, but maintaining them required increasing effort. Fishing, which had once been reliable, became less predictable as weather and currents changed. Some days passed with very little food. Even when fish were caught, the physical work required to pull them from the water had become more difficult. Lim's body had endured continuous exposure to sun, wind, and salt water for weeks, without shelter beyond the small cover he had constructed from pieces of canvas. The skin on his arms and face had hardened under the constant sun, but sores and irritation from salt water were unavoidable. The raft itself had not changed. It was still a narrow platform drifting across the ocean. Its small size left little room for movement, and long periods of sitting or crouching created stiffness and exhaustion. Sleep came in short intervals, often interrupted by waves washing across the wooden slats. Water remained uncertain. Rainstorms continued to provide occasional relief, but there were stretches of clear sky when the containers stayed empty for days. During these periods, Lim relied on the moisture from fish and birds to maintain minimal hydration. The ocean environment also continued to present constant psychological strain. The horizon remained unchanged in every direction. Day after day, there was no land, no sign of permanent shelter, and often no sign of other human presence. Ships sometimes appeared in the far distance, but from the level of the raft, they were small shapes that could vanish quickly behind waves or haze. Lim continued to use flares when a vessel seemed close enough to notice him. Each time, the result was uncertain. Several ships passed within sight during the months he drifted, but none altered their course toward the raft. Time itself had begun to blur. The marks he had carved into the wood were no longer entirely reliable. Storms had washed away some of the earlier markings, and fatigue sometimes caused him to lose count. Still, the raft continued moving. Ocean currents carried it slowly westward, though Lim had no way to measure the distance traveled. What had begun as survival measured in days had now stretched into survival measured in months. By early April 1943, the raft had been drifting for more than 4 months. And somewhere ahead, beyond the open Atlantic, land was slowly coming closer. In April 1943, after months of drifting across the Atlantic, the raft carrying Poon Lim had moved far from the area where the SS Benlamond had sunk. Ocean currents had carried the small platform steadily westward. Without navigation equipment, Lim had no way of knowing how far he had traveled or where the raft was heading. By this point, 133 days had passed since the night the ship disappeared beneath the water. On the 5th of April, 1943, fishermen working near the coast of Brazil noticed something unusual on the surface of the ocean. At first, it appeared to be a small floating structure drifting slowly in the water. As their boat moved closer, they realized that someone was on the raft. Lim had been carried close to the Brazilian coastline by the Atlantic currents. The fishermen approached carefully and helped pull him aboard their vessel. After more than 4 months alone at sea, he was no longer on the drifting platform that had sustained him. Reports from the time noted that he was extremely thin and heavily sunburned, but he remained conscious and able to move. Despite the length of the ordeal, his physical condition was stronger than rescuers had expected. From the fishing boat, he was taken to land. Medical care and rest followed after his arrival on shore. The long period of exposure, limited food, and constant dehydration had placed severe strain on his body, but he had survived the crossing of a large section of the Atlantic Ocean alone. The raft that had carried him for months was left behind. The ocean that had surrounded him for 133 days was finally no longer his horizon. After reaching land in Brazil, the survival of Poon Lim gradually became known beyond the small coastal community where he had first been brought ashore. He had drifted alone on the Atlantic for 133 days, a length of time that placed his experience among the longest documented survivals on a life raft in open ocean. From Brazil, Lim was eventually transported through Allied channels back into the broader wartime system of shipping and administration. Officials from the British merchant fleet recorded the details of his survival, noting the methods he had used to remain alive during the months at sea. The account drew attention not because of drama, but because of its practical value. Lim had managed to survive by building a disciplined routine. He caught fish using improvised hooks, collected rainwater during storms, and adapted the limited materials of the raft into tools that extended his ability to endure the ocean environment. These methods were later studied by naval authorities. The Royal Navy recognized the significance of the survival. Lim was awarded the British Empire Medal, and elements of his experience were incorporated into survival training for sailors and airmen who might one day face similar conditions at sea. The raft itself disappeared back into the Atlantic currents. The ocean where the SS Benlamond had sunk remained unchanged, continuing its wide and quiet movement between continents. For Lim, the months alone on that drifting platform became a permanent part of his life's history, an event that had taken place far from land, and for long stretches of time, far from any witness.